A devotee asks, actions are more important to perform than sitting idle. How to explain this to teens?
Actions are an inseparable part of human life. No one in this creation can remain without action even for a single moment. No one. Nahi kaschit kshanamapi jatu tishtati akarmakrit. As Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, no, nothing in this so-called creation is stationary. Nothing is static. Everything is moving. So action is an inseparable part of human life. This is the first thing. Now, it is important to always be active. To be active is more preferable than to be inactive or lazy or idle. Why? A person who is engaging in some action is that arena where we constantly improve ourselves. So action is that so-called playground, a playground which is meant for continuous self-correction and self-improvement. If you don't act, if you don't engage in action, you will never be learning and improving yourself or correcting your own defects. So a person who is idle, lazy, who doesn't want to act, who remains slothy and sleepy throughout the day, that person will never grow and improve in life. So it is definitely preferable to be continuously in action. And while acting, that person may commit many mistakes. That those mistakes are welcome. Because those mistakes, in and through those mistakes, we have an occasion to learn and make ourselves free from those mistakes. So every action becomes an occasion for self-correction and self-improvement. That's why our teenagers should understand that this field of action is an occasion for everyone to learn from our own mistakes and correct ourselves and make ourselves better and better. That's the reason why it is said that actions, to be engaged in actions, are more preferable than to be idle and not to be engaged in action.
There is a follow-up question. Is there any difference between nationalism and Rashtriyavad?
Actually, nationalism and Rashtriyavad, they are synonymous, as we understand in so-called the Indian context. Nationalism is Rashtriyavad. Rashtriyavad is, it's a simple translation of Rashtriyavad is the so-called Sanskrit or the Hindi translation of the term nationalism. Or you may say vice versa, if somebody has to translate Rashtriyavad into English language. So the best word would be nationalism. So they are not two different terms, they are synonymous.
Another follow-up. What is the difference between nationalism in the Indian context and nationalism in the Western context?
Nationalism in the Western context is very different from the nationalism in the Indian context. For example, nationalism in the Western context completely stands upon the attitude of tremendous love for one's own nation, a great sense of pride for one's own nation, perfectly fine. But along with that, there is a great so-called hatred for the other nations. Even if it is not hatred for other nations, there is a sense of superiority and looking down upon all other nations. That kind of an attitude we'll find in the so-called the concept of nationalism from the so-called European standpoint, where nationalism breeds on the attitude of how much we are superior to others, or it also breeds on the attitude of a kind of a hatred for the so-called other nations of the world. In contrast to this Rashtravad or nationalism in the Indian context is very different. Rashtravad or nationalism in the Indian context is completely based upon the principle of dharma. This is the first thing which we Indians have to understand. Nationhood in India is completely based upon dharma, which is Sanatana. Sanatana dharma. It is a scientific principle, a principle which is universally and eternally existing. It is this principle which is the very basis of the nationhood of the so-called India or Bharat. So this can be discussed in a much more detailed manner. But in this context, in an answer to this question, it would be sufficient to understand that nationalism in Indian context is completely dependent upon dharma, in which we don't hate other countries. There is no hatred for the other countries, other nations in the world. Nationalism in Indian context does not breed upon this attitude of, what should I say, we are superior and others are inferior. On the contrary, dharma teaches us to look upon everybody as equal. And this ideology is the speciality of India in India alone, because this vision is coming from the great Sanatana Dharma, which teaches us to look upon everybody as divine and the whole world as one family. So this unique ideology, which is at the base of the nationhood of this great country called Bharat, this is what actually distinguishes Rashtravad of India from the Rashtravad of the so-called the European kind, where it flourishes on so-called superiority, a sense of superiority complex, or even it flourishes on the attitude of a kind of a hatred for the so-called other nations. So, in Indian context, Rashtravad is based upon dharma, which teaches us to look upon all the nations as our own self, with a vision of equality, and not taking a position of being superior to others. But this itself unconsciously makes so-called India superior in a way, because this attitude is not naturally existing among other groups of the people, which is the foundation of so-called India's nationhood, which is based upon dharma.